I'm outside of the Slave Haven Underground Railroad Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, and did a tour. Technically, I did the tour twice, and I took a bunch of notes, and I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I learned while I was on the tour. Well, a couple of things that I wanted to talk about initially was some of the sort of what I found to be like contemporary ties between slavery, I guess you could say like slavery times and now. Something that was said initially early on in the tour that really stood out to me was the idea of a general wanted poster for runaway slaves, especially because after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, it's loud, because especially after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, that made it legal basically for people to catch freed slaves or escaped slaves, and even, you know, freedmen that were never slaves, and sell them into bondage. And in order to do this, accomplish this, you had to have sort of a general wanted poster that was just like a general black person to kind of give people the right to catch you and sell you into slavery. And when I heard her say that in the tour, it immediately made me think of wanted posters in terms of jails and prisons and things that we even see now. Oh, there was a suspicious figure, a person of interest, a wanted person, and how so often these are so general and so vague. Oh, it was a black male between, you know, 5'8" and 6'4", which is like a huge range, with brown skin, you know, just like a very general, very vague description so that you can catch anybody. You can pick up any fucking black person as a person of interest. It's like such a parallel between slavery and these wanted posters, and the way that we even deal with the judiciary system and the legal system and the prisons and the jails now, and the use of these persons of interest. Oh, he was a person of interest, he was a suspect, so we shot him. It's the same thing, right? Like, it's the same idea, it's the same concept. So when I heard her say that during the tour, it really stood out. Another thing that she said during the tour, which really struck me, the parallels between American chattel slavery and the current modern day prison system here in the United States, was the idea of stock examination. So at the slave market, the enslaved people were standing basically on the auction block naked, and they were examined by prospective buyers to make sure that they weren't sick, that they were healthy, they didn't have broken limbs, they didn't have marked skin, you know, again, illness or anything like that. So they were just standing there naked and examined. And then again, what my mind went to in terms of the prison system is that when you get arrested and you're getting ready to be put into prison or in jail, they strip you naked and they examine you and they search you and they make sure you don't have any contraband, and they make sure you're not sick, and they test you to make sure you don't have any type of STDs or illnesses, and they look all in your mouth and they look all up inside of your orifices to make sure you're not smuggling anything or have any drugs or anything. And again, it just struck me of like these parallels, especially just between the American chattel slavery system and the prison system. And it's like so much, and Michelle Alexander has talked about this so much in terms of the new Jim Crow and the new slavery, in terms of the 13th Amendment and mass incarceration, and this idea that so much of basically the way that our modern day American prison system is run is slavery. We have all these ideas and practices that are literally borrowed from slavery. You had a general wanted poster so that you could arrest Black Americans and put them in bondage, and now you have a general, you fit the description, you're a person of interest, you're a suspicious figure, where you can arrest people and put them in bondage. You had people that were standing on the auction block stripped naked being examined before they were purchased. You have Black Americans that are stripped naked before they're put into the system, the prison system. And it's just like, it is the same. It's the same. And something that they were also talking about that I wrote down was, she said that we have and these were her exact words, I wrote down her exact words. She said, even if the physical violence is no longer allowed, so even if the physical violence of American chattel slavery is no longer allowed, the emotional and psychological wounds of slavery are still alive. The shackles and chains are no longer on the wrist, but they are now on the mind, in terms of the way that we are treated in this country. And it was just like such not eye-opening, because my eyes were already open, but almost like a reinforcement. Like, I went inside of the slave haven, and I know maybe for some people it would be like really upsetting, but like I don't feel upset. To me it feels like reinforcement of like, I know what the fuck is going on. Like, we know what's going on. Like, we are still in bondage. Like, we're still in bondage. And some other things that I wanted to talk about that I didn't know about. She talked a lot about codes, hidden codes on the Underground Railroad. I knew about the hidden codes in Negro spirituals and things like, wade in the water, which means go through the water to mask your scent from the dogs and the dog catchers. I say repeatedly, I don't like dogs. I'm afraid of them. I do feel like there's an aspect of intergenerational trauma to that for me personally. Like, I have an aversion to dogs that I do think, as a descendant of American chattel slavery, goes back to the idea of dog catchers fucking chasing me, just like how there's a lot of Black Americans that don't like water for those same types of reasons. But what they also talked about was the history of quilts, which I wasn't too familiar with, and the codes that were in quilts, which I took some notes on. Quilt patterns that give you an idea of what to do next and how to escape. So you go to the different stops on the Underground Railroad, which they explain that underground means secret and railroad means stops. So it wasn't literally an underground railroad, but it was secret stops. So you go to your various stops and you might see quilts hanging in the window, or you might see quilts over the door, or you might see quilts on a clothesline or hanging outside to dry. And the quilts would have specific patterns that give you an idea of what to do next and how to escape. So an example of some quilt patterns included the Flying Geese, which was a quilt pattern, the Drunkard's Path, which was a quilt pattern, and the North Star, which was a quilt pattern. So if you see these three quilts, for an example, that means Flying Geese, stay on the Drunkard's Path and follow the North Star, which means geese flying. When you see the geese flying, follow them. Canadian geese fly north at a certain time of year. Flying geese also means runaway. The Drunkard's Path, which isn't the straight path, which means you need to zig and zag, you need to double your tracks, wade in the water, run drunkenly to make it hard to find you. And then you have follow the North Star, which is ultimately follow the North Star. And also, even if it's late at night, if it's dark, if it's cloudy, overcast, if it's raining, if you're lost, you're confused, there was also this concept of hug the trees, because the moss grows on the north side of the tree. So wherever you feel the moss is the direction you need to go in, which I didn't know. I never heard of that. And also, what's behind me is a magnolia tree, which is one of the original magnolia trees of Memphis, which was brought here from New Orleans, Louisiana, and planted here specifically for the purpose of being an evergreen tree, a tree that would be green all year and that would have moss growing on the north side of it as a hidden symbol, as a code to let people know that they can stop here. This is a safe haven, and also to let people know that if you continue to follow this path, you're heading north to freedom. So I just felt like I learned a lot. I am going to include more information in the description box and links and more video, because we also took some video around the ground. You can't take pictures or video inside, but I just wanted to film this really quick because that was like an awesome experience, and I'm so excited that I was able to come here. So yeah, that's it. we're standing outside of the Lorraine Motel, which is now National Civil Rights Museum. And so seeing a lot of the ways that some of this stuff is presented is very interesting in the formation of a narrative. We were talking about how there's a plaque in the front of this museum that's talking about how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. even came to Memphis to support the sanitation strike. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a democratic socialist. This is something that they don't tell you. He was also a staunch anti-capitalist, and he came here to support the strike as part of the poor people's movement. And a lot of his anti-capitalism work and his speaking out against not only capitalism but the bipartisan American government was a huge part of why the government was against him. And that's not really something that we learn. He was killed, and we were presented with the the I Have a Dream narrative, and it's just very interesting to see the way that a lot of these narratives continue to be perpetuated in these public spots like these museums. Finishing at the National Civil Rights Museum is obviously dark now. It's like 2-3 hours later. So this museum is in two parts. The first part is like the main Civil Rights Museum, where they really detail the history of the Civil Rights Movement sort of broadly. And the second part of the museum, which is across the street, talks more specifically about Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in particular, which I think is pretty appropriate considering that this museum is located in the Lorraine Hotel, which was a Black-owned hotel, which I didn't know. I just learned that at this museum. The second portion of the museum, which I just came out of, was really quite interesting. They talk about how it was originally believed that pretty much, a lone gunman, lone wolf, lone assassin, all those words, acted to murder Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but that sort of in recent years and subsequent years, that evidence has come to the forefront that basically leads a lot of people to believe that the government was involved, that the FBI was involved, that the CIA was involved. There are a lot of questions about how did the gunman know specifically where Martin Luther King was going to be, at what time, and that there's evidence that there was collusion between the government, the American government, and the FBI and the CIA in his assassination, which I was a bit surprised to actually see in the museum. And they actually did discuss as well this was in the second part that focuses specifically on his assassination. There was also some discussion as well about the fact that towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was becoming much more radicalized, that he was now it still didn't say anywhere that he was a democratic socialist, not that I saw, but they did speak on how he was becoming much more radicalized and how he was a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War, how he was also a vocal opponent of capitalism. He was an anti-capitalist, how he was speaking out against what he called the immorality of poverty and was really trying to bring to light the issues with poverty, especially among Black Americans in the United States. His work with the Poor People's Campaign, and how these things specifically, his anti-capitalist beliefs and his speaking out against poverty and also his speaking out against the Vietnam War, was making him, in addition to his work with anti-Black racism and the Civil Rights Movement, was making him a target by the United States government. And they said that he was definitely being followed, he was being shadowed by the FBI, by the CIA, which I already knew. You guys can look that up if you didn't know that. They were monitoring him, following him, tapping his phone, sending him threatening letters, So there was a lot of kind of discussing what is the culpability of the United States government in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which I was just super fucking surprised to see in a museum setting, because people act like that shit is just like a conspiracy, but it's really not. Like, it's legit. So I wanted to talk about that. I was excited to see that. Two things that I also wanted to mention that I thought about while I was in the main portion of the museum was, number one, the fact that pretty much, this is talked about towards the end of the main exhibit, the fact that pretty much every modern day movement for human rights and civil rights worldwide, globally, has piggybacked off of the civil rights movement of the American blacks, the descendants of American chattel slavery. Every single one. Like, we had Bloody Sunday here. A few years later, they had Bloody Monday in Europe. You know, we really set the blueprint. They mentioned the Stonewall riots. They mentioned women's marches for rights and equality. That Black Americans, descendants of American chattel slavery, like, we set the standard. We fight for our rights, and everybody else follows, and not only follows but uses what we do as a blueprint, mimics us, utilizes accomplishments and achievements that we achieved to piggyback themselves. We've been talking a lot about how the one of the huge keystones of the civil rights era was also fighting for the rights of immigrants and for more immigrants to come to this country. And it is mentioned in the museum how people basically piggyback off of everything we do and utilize everything that we do as a blueprint for their own movements, which I just find, now of course this is framed as a positive, and I'm not trying to say that it's not positive, but sort of like I've continuously been talking about, nobody has to put back in the pot. Nobody has to put back in the pot for Black Americans, for DACS. Everybody can just take. We are this endless well of inspiration, of creativity in the arts and academia, in activism, and all these A's, the way I like to think of it, but nobody has to give back. Nobody has to put back into the pot. There's no consideration of the state that we're in, and it's very ironic that as somebody that was speaking out more towards the end of his life about poverty, and specifically what was going on with descendants of American chattel slavery as a result of capitalism, MLK was then assassinated. You know, I don't think that was a coincidence. Because I do think, as I've been talking about, that there are hierarchical structures, infrastructure, and institution that's designed for us to remain at the bottom, you know, this sort of permanent underclass that everybody gets to build on top of. And I felt like that was reinforced by what I saw in this museum, especially towards the end, this featuring of how pretty much every modern day movement has grown out of what we have done. And I also wanted to touch on another thing that I've said previously in my videos on integration that struck me again, which is that you have all these ideas that are basically, they're failed social experiments. Integration was a failed social experiment. Voter registration was something of a failed social experiment. You know, this idea that, well, if we could integrate, if we could go to the white schools, what would happen? You know, would our communities be improved? Would our lot in life be improved? And that didn't happen. What actually ended up happening was a siphoning off of what you could consider our best and brightest into white institutions, and a forcible moving and assimilating of us into white communities that are still racist, that are still hostile, that nothing changed except the forcible moving of us into these communities. You know, the Lorraine was a Black-owned hotel. Could we name a Black-owned hotel today? No, because one of the offsets, unexpected offsets of integration was that, you know, we ended up in white society and not in our own society. So, failed social experiment. You know, the Voter Registration Act, which said, you know, oh, Negroes need the right to vote so that we can elect elected officials that are going to work for us in our favor. Did that happen? No, failed social experiment. We have a lot of ideas about our society and things that's going to work for us, and I've said before, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I think he was hugely important. He's been hugely influential on a lot of my ideas, especially as he was an anti-capitalist and a democratic socialist, and he did speak out against white moderates and elitism in the left. But I think a lot of the ideas were ideas, right? They were ideas. They were philosophy, and the way that they were enacted maybe wasn't the best way, and ultimately, in my opinion, they were failed social experiments. And viewing this stuff in these museums does make me think that a lot of these concepts are perhaps outdated, and maybe it's time for us to start thinking in some new, different ways. Really informative stuff, though. Highly recommend that anyone that can make it can come see it. And for anyone that can't make it and can't come see it, hopefully you guys enjoyed these videos and this information. And as soon as you start talking that anti-capitalism shit, that poor people shit, that I'm against this war, this Vietnam War shit. In addition to you trying to fucking rile up these American Negroes with this anti-black racism shit, you gotta go. Gotta go. Black identity extremists. That was mentioned too. How the FBI targeted black committees and organizations like the Black Panthers and put them on these terrorist watch lists, but the KKK didn't go on no watch list, and we're still seeing that today in 2018. Black identity extremists. Hi, Asian James, I know you're watching. But yeah, good day, good trip, solid. And a quick addendum that I wanted to say about philosophy and ideas is that, you know, people, activists, philosophers, thought leaders, I know people like that phrase, thought leaders, you come up with ideas, you come up with concepts, and, you know, you sort of put your ideas out into the world. And once your ideas are out into the world, you don't really have any idea of how they're going to be implemented or how they're going to play out over time. And as a visionary, as a great thinker, philosopher, thought leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came up with a lot of really great ideas that he did put out into the world in terms of, you know, social experiments. And unfortunately, he was murdered before he had the opportunity to see them be implemented or see them come to fruition. So even when I say that a lot of these things could be considered, you know, failed social experiments, especially integration and the Voter Registration Act and stuff like that, who knows, like maybe if he had lived, he could have steered the ship a little differently, which is why our leaders are assassinated, so we are left without them, and so we don't know what we're doing. And it's very deliberate, and you put your idea out there, you never know what's going to happen. So I just wanted to add that. Yeah.